Okay, let's look at Standard 20, Substandard D. Describe the Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive, and the growing opposition to the war, to the Vietnam War here. This is also part of the Cold War, so let's not forget that. But our focus here is on the Vietnam War itself and on the Tet Offensive and how the Tet Offensive changed the public support or lack of support for the Vietnam War. In this case, lack of support. So here's the language of the standards. So Vietnam, the Tet Offensive, and the growing opposition to the war. The Tet Offensive is going to result in this growing opposition to the war. Themes are conflict and compromise, political and social interactions, and then the domestic impact of the Cold War. Let's look at the Vietnam War first. The Vietnam War is very much part of containment policy, very much part of the Cold War that began when Truman made his Truman Doctrine in 1947, but it is here, 1955 to 1975, 19 years actually, that the Vietnam War is going to be fought. And this is Tet Offensive in 1968 that is going to change the direction of the war. This growing opposition to it is actually going to bring it down and have it come to a halt by 1975. So that's what we're looking at. Alright, so in 1950s, 1954 I believe it was, yeah, 1954, Ho Chi Minh here was a communist that wanted to take control over Vietnam, and he was communist. And Ngo Dinh Diem here was a capitalist who also wanted to control Vietnam. So there was a problem between these two guys over the control of Vietnam. And at this time, the French owned Vietnam. It was actually called, before this time, French Indochina. It's going to be called Vietnam when these guys get control of it. So these guys are fighting over control of Vietnam, and this starts a war, a revolution there. Either communist or capitalist, Vietnam was at stake. And the United States was under this domino theory, really did not want Vietnam here to fall to communism. And so let's look at what happens. In 1954, at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the French are defeated by Ho Chi Minh, the communist here. And so the French withdraw from Vietnam, and they had to sign the Geneva Accords to withdraw from Vietnam. But the United States refused to sign the Geneva Accords and instead stayed in Vietnam and become the dominant Western power there in French Indochina. Now it's just Indochina, and these two guys want to take it over. And so the United States backs Ngo Dinh Diem, the guy that is capitalist that wants to take over Vietnam. And then the Soviet Union is going to come in, and China is going to back Ho Chi Minh, this communist here, and his communist takeover of Vietnam. And the United States wants to help southern Vietnam because of the domino theory. This idea that if Vietnam falls to communism, Laos will, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, Bangladesh. Next thing you know, you're going to be here in the Western Hemisphere. Here are all those places. Laos is here, Cambodia here, Thailand here, Burma here, and this is Vietnam. And this is a part of the containment doctrine. They didn't want communism spreading into these areas over here, in these countries over here. So they wanted to stop the spread of communism here in Vietnam. That's why the United States is going to back this capitalist here in the takeover of Vietnam. It's the domino effect that they come up with. And four presidents are going to stay in Vietnam from 1955 to 1975 under this containment during the Cold War in Vietnam. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, President John F. Kennedy, President Lyndon Johnson, and President Nixon is going to escalate Vietnamization, but he wanted to take us out of Vietnam, doesn't get a chance to. We're going to talk about that later. And then President Gerald Ford eventually pulls us out. But these four presidents escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam over these 19 years. We never declared war, and Congress is going to change some things about presidential power after this. But it's this containment during the Cold War. And let's listen to these five presidents, and I'm going to put this arrow down here on each one of these as they talk about this domino effect.
So when the United States votes $400 million to help that war, We're not voting for a giveaway program. We're voting for the cheapest way that we can prevent the occurrence of something that would be of the most terrible significance to the United States of America, our security.
That was Dwight Eisenhower.
If we withdrew from Vietnam, the communists would control Vietnam. Pretty soon, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Malaya would go.
President Kennedy.
If this little nation goes down the drain and can't maintain her independence, ask yourself what's going to happen to all the other little nations.
President Johnson.
If the United States now were to throw in the towel and come home, and the communists took over South Vietnam, then all over Southeast Asia, all over the Pacific, in the Mideast, in Europe, in the world, the United States would suffer a blow. And peace, because we are the great peacekeeping nation in the world today because of our power, would suffer a blow from which it might not recover.
So this is this fight over communism and capitalism is part of the Cold War. This is containment foreign policy through these four presidents. We see that in Vietnam. So here we see Vietnam War, here the Tet Offensive is very much part of containment policy, U.S. foreign policy to contain or stop the spread of communism. You just heard it from their own mouths. But yeah, that is. Okay, now we were supposed to describe the Vietnam War. We just did, and how it comes into the Cold War and containment. Now we're supposed to talk about the Tet Offensive and the growing opposition to the Vietnam War. It's going to eventually move us to get out of it. So the Tet Offensive is very important. Tet is a holiday in Vietnam, and the offensive means that North Vietnam is going to go on the offensive and fight an offensive war rather than a defensive one. So in January 1968, up here in yellow, this is North Vietnam. The North Vietnamese is talking about these people up here in the yellow, and the Viet Cong. Now the Viet Cong were the groups down here that lived in South Vietnam, but they wanted to be communists, so they were supporting Ho Chi Minh and the communists of North Vietnam. And so in January 1968, they're going to launch this offensive attack, this coordinated major offensive attack against South Vietnam and the U.S. forces there in 27 cities. The largest one right down here is Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, where Ngo Dinh Diem was a leader. Down here, they're going to attack these 27 different locations. Heavy fighting is going to be here in Saigon. And what's important about the Tet Offensive, and we don't have to go through each one of these in detail, although some people do. What we want to talk about is this Tet Offensive and how it affected American or political support of the war, public opinion of the Vietnam War. Because the president during this time said that, Johnson said that there wasn't much violence. We were winning the war. And the Tet Offensive, what it's going to do is it's going to be televised on TV, and a lot of violence here is going to be shown on television, and people in their living rooms are going to be watching this violence. This here is where a South Vietnamese general shoots a Viet Cong shoots them dead on national television. So they watch that, and it's televised. And at home, all this violence being shown on the Tet Offensive in Saigon. Here's the President Lyndon Johnson, watching it on TV. It's going to cause this psychological defeat for the United States and their involvement over in Vietnam. It's going to be a psychological victory for the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, because it's going to make a lot of people question whether we should be in Vietnam to begin with. In other words, a return to isolationist thinking, although the U.S. foreign policy was not isolationist. The people's ideas were a call for isolationism again. So the impact of the television and news reporting this violence in people's homes made many people start opposing the war. So a growing opposition to the people. Not that there weren't any people opposing the war before, but that more people, an increased number, started to oppose the war and U.S. involvement in Vietnam, excuse me. So essentially what we have here is that because of the televised violence in the Tet Offensive, that the number of people that were opposing the Vietnam War increases. The opposition to the war increases because of the televised violence of the Tet Offensive here. Okay. So that's extremely important to understand. All right, and then after this, even on college campuses, this group called themselves the Students for Democratic Society, SDS, and they start protesting on college campuses. SDS does about the war in Vietnam, and they want to create this political pressure to get the United States government to end the war in Vietnam, and call the troops back home. And then in May 4th, 1970. On television, it was televised, it come to a head, some really strong violence at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio, where students were protesting the U.S. invasion of Cambodia in 1970. And a lot of students went out throwing Molotov cocktails, these bottles with gasoline on it set on fire, throwing them. The students were throwing them at the ROTC building. They were protesting, marching, acting belligerent. And they called the police in at first, and the police called in the Ohio National Guard to put down this protest. And some students threw some rocks at the guards and acted real belligerent and oppositional to them. And in the melee of all this going on, the Ohio National Guard fired into the crowd of students. 61 to 67 shots were fired in 13 seconds, and when the smoke cleared, there were 4 students laying dead and 9 were wounded. And this picture here with this girl, with one of the deceased victims here, I guess you can call them victims, but this girl here is crying over this dead body. This is a Kent State Massacre, some people call it, the Kent State shootings. Divided the country. Some of the people in the country call these students who were acting this way a bunch of bums. You know, they got shot because they threw rocks at armed guards. And then the other group were real understanding and caring, so that the National Guard should not have shot these kids. It was uncalled for. So big controversy in the United States with this growing opposition to the war. And this incident shows that a lot of people, especially college students, started opposing the Vietnam War, and it increased after the Tet Offensive. And with that, I think we've met our standard. Describe the Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive, and grow in opposition to the war. If you have any further questions, ask them in class. Raise your hand. Good luck on the quiz, test, and EOCT.